My name's Caroline Beckett. I'm the Vicar of Brightlingsea, and I'm currently hiding out in my dining room for a little bit of peace and quiet.
My name's Andy Griffiths. I coordinate training for the Diocese of Chelmsford. I'm in the spare room. I've got a blind behind me, and it's really difficult to stop the sunlight streaming into the picture.
And my name is Jonathan Cox. I'm the Deputy Director of Citizens UK, and I'm also a member of Holy Cross Church in Wales Parish in the Diocese of Llandaff in South Wales. And I'm currently sat in our spare room, looking out over some quite gorgeous weather, really, and slightly regretting the fact that I'm not joining my family on the beach this afternoon.
And together we are
at a distance.
Rethinking Christian
leadership.
Jonathan, it is so good to have you with us, especially because you're missing out on a beach to be here. So here's what we've covered so far in this series of podcasts.
Well, first we introduced ourselves, and in episodes 2 to 3, we looked at what community organising is. We believe in 50-50 Christian leaders. That is, leaders who spend roughly half their time and energy on things that are internal to the church, pastoral care and worship and congregational development, and roughly half on things that are external, like running food banks and evangelism and building alliances for the common good. And our central argument is that the best way we know to do that, not just the external part, but all of it, is community organising.
Community organising has a process to it. And if you do it in the wrong order, it doesn't work as well. So in episodes 4 and 5, we looked at the first stage of community organising, which is organising, or if you prefer, community building.
Stage 2 is listening, and we looked at that in episodes 6 to 8.
Stage 3 is planning, and episodes 9 to 11 looked at that.
We called stage 4 action through public storytelling, and episodes 12 to 14 looked at that.
So here we are at episode 15. In our next episode, we'll start looking at the final stage, which is all about tables, oddly enough. But today we thought we'd step back and answer some questions. We started these podcasts right back in early March in a very different world. And today it's the 14th of June. Jonathan, could you give us an overview of how the world has changed since we started?
Sure, and to join you on the podcast, Andy and Caroline. I mean, I was looking back at my calendar today, and my son is starting a new project. He's setting up a comic book with some of his friends, and in order to keep him focused and sustain this through, we thought using a calendar to see him through to September, which is probably when he's going to be back in school properly, would be good. And so I went and found him my calendar for 2020, and it starts pretty full. And January, February, March, but also if you look at it, there's a real rhythm to it. The nature of my work is I supervise a number of citizens chapters across the country. Essex is one of those, Thames Valley is another, Birmingham, Somerset, and then I also have some responsibilities in our HQ in London, as well as leading our work in Wales. So as you can imagine from that, I travel a lot, and I had a pretty strong rhythm to my work life. One Monday a month, I would be in Essex, another Monday in a month, be in Somerset, another Monday a month, I would be in Thames Valley, and so on and so forth. And I travel. On a Monday morning, I drop the kids off at school, and then I get on a train, probably for quite a long period of time, and travel to Colchester or Oxford or Milton Keynes or Birmingham or whatever. And I'd spend my time supervising and helping to nurture our staff, our community organisers in those places, and also meeting with key leaders like yourselves in Essex to organise toward a big moment of accountability, because in kind of April, May of this year, we had very ambitious plans around the country. In London, my colleagues were planning a massive accountability assembly with the mayoral candidates for Mayor of London. We'd hired Copper Box, 6,000 seats that we had booked out. In Essex, we had, as you know, a police and fire and crime commissioner accountability assembly due to happen at Anglia Ruskin University, and similar things in Thames Valley and Birmingham and so on. And when down hit, we were right at the critical time of beginning those accountability meetings, thinking of having hundreds and thousands of people coming together in tightly packed rooms, definitely not socially distanced. And lockdown went smack into the middle of that. So you can imagine how discombobulating that was for me, for our staff, and for leaders we were working with around the country, and also for my family, who suddenly weren't waving goodbye to me on a Monday and then probably not seeing me on Wednesday, because I'm now here all the time. So there's been some massive shifts, really. And one of the things I've noticed as well is somebody told me, another Anglican priest actually told me about this. He said he's an area dean, and part of his dean's area dean role is to help provide some supervision and support to a number of different clergy. And it means that he goes to activities in lots of different parishes. And he described to me something which sort of perfectly encapsulates how it's an issue for me, really. And he described it as the concertina effect. So if you imagine a kind of an accordion, one of those sort of musical instruments that you sort of, I think you're pumping air into it by moving it back and forth, and then you play the little keyboards on the side. And he said, what coronavirus has done and what the lockdown has done is squeezed everything in. And that really struck a chord with me, because actually, whereas I used to have this very strong monthly rhythm of going to a place once a month, and we'd wait a month until we sort things out, now we can do everything pretty much instantly on Zoom. And so work that used to have to be done in a month, now people are demanding is done in a week. And so for those of us who are parts of lots of different project teams or lots of different geographical groups, are kind of bearing the brunt of that a bit, because everybody else is keen to move on quickly. But what they don't quite realise is that I've got 9 groups wanting to move on quickly. And so I thought naively at the start of the lockdown, this is great. I won't have to travel. I'm going to have loads of time for reading and reflection and writing and all the sorts of things I never get the time to do. And it just hasn't been that way. I don't know if that resonates with you.
Yeah.
Either of your experiences.
I can so relate to everything you're saying.
So part of the challenge in the last couple of weeks. Once we were out of that initial.
So how is community organising generally?
Caroline, I didn't quite catch that. It cut out.
Don't worry. Keep going. We've got glitches.
Okay. So one of the challenges I've been trying to sort of work on personally is to try and stretch out the concertina again, and to try and put in, even if it isn't kind of parametered by having to travel to particular places, because that's still a slightly distant prospect, I think, for us, to at least try and manage my diary. For those of you who've been on citizenship training, you'll know that we have a whole section on scheduling, which I often teach. So I need to take some of my own medicine here about actually trying to space things out across the diary, rather than sort of giving into the temptation to stick it all in immediately because there's space in the calendar or the diary to do so. It's been quite interesting too in terms of thinking about how we adjust community organising as a methodology, because again, if you've done the training or you've been involved, you'll know it's very much about the face-to-face. We've got one-to-one meetings that are people meeting to build relationship one-to-one in a cafe or in their home or whatever. We can't do one-to-ones at the minute in a face-to-face way. We do a lot of training in training venues. We can't do any of that. We run big public actions. Well, we have done 1 or 2 actions, but they're quite difficult to do in a socially distanced way, and we have to think about people who might be shielding, and lots of people in our member organisations have underlying health conditions, and it's complicated. And then assemblies, large gatherings of huge groups of people in rooms. Again, we just can't do those. So we were able to do quite a quick pivot, actually, and we were helped in this by reflecting on our mission. And what we realized pretty quickly was that we had to distinguish between our method and our mission. Because for a lot of people, it was like, well, we can't do community organizing because you can't do one-to-ones and you can't do assemblies and you can't do action. And when we actually went and reflected on our mission, which is about strengthening civil society institutions, about developing leaders in public life, and thirdly, taking action for social justice and working for the common good, well, actually, in lockdown, there's even a greater need for that than there is in normal times. So what we've had to do is think about how do we continue to live out our mission faithfully and indeed help leaders within our institutions to do that when our method is kind of prescribed by the by the lockdown. So we've been doing lots of stuff. We're getting very familiar with Zoom, helping people think about what's the appropriate way in which you can do one-to-ones during lockdown. How can you do training? We have a big Thursday afternoon Zoom call where we have hundreds of people from across the country gather to get training or insight, or just to share stories of how they're dealing with it and coping with it in their setting. And there are some real glimmers of hope. You guys in Essex pioneered the Accountability Assembly online on Zoom with the Police and Fire and Crime Commissioner, and that's had a wonderful impact. And one of the things it's done is it's really inspired and encouraged other people across the country to do the same thing. So this Thursday, Thames Valley, another fairly new chapter covering Milton Keynes, Reading, Oxford, and kind of the wider rural hinterland around that, had their first online accountability assembly with their police commissioner and also leaders of local authorities, directors of NHS trusts, and this sort of thing. So, and it's not the same as doing it offline, but it was still meaningful and still had purpose. So, yeah, it's a challenge, but we're rising to it. But how's it been for you? I mean, lots of changes for us, but how are Brightlingsea and Chelmsford different for you compared to when you started this podcast in mid-March?
Well, I can hardly remember mid-March, but I worked for the Diocese of Chelmsford, and right at the beginning, we were aware of a diagram, which I'm going to share now on screen. This was produced by the US Department of Health and Human Services, and you can think of it as a kind of sinus rhythm, like the line you might see on a healthy heart monitor. And it starts with what they call pre-disaster, and then there's a heroic phase where everyone's adrenaline is going at full pelt, and you reach something they call community cohesion. Maybe, I don't know, 3-4 weeks into the crisis, and then you hit the cliff. The slump, as it's called, the disillusionment, where typically there's polarization and everything goes wrong. And then you've got the gradual recovery to what was already, even before lockdown, being called the new normal, which we would emerge in the other side of the crisis. So people like me, right at the beginning, we were bombarding everyone that we could think of, which usually meant ministers in the Diocese of Chelmsford, in our case, with lots of resources. So many resources that I was starting to get people saying, you're sending us too much stuff, to which my response is, well, don't read it yet then, but we're sticking it out there. And there were two motives in the stuff we were sending out. The first was to try and soften these curves. You know, back then there was an awful lot of talk about flattening curves of various kinds. And we wanted to soften the heroic curve because that would stop the disillusionment slump being quite as extreme. So we were saying to people, we need some lament as well as some action. We need you to space things out and not work 24-hour days because that's ridiculous. This is long term. And I think we were saying to people, look, you may think this is a 3-week thing. It really isn't going to be a 3-week thing. It's going to be a lot longer. And I think the Bishop of London at that time said, you do realize that most of our congregation members aren't going to be back in a building worshipping in 2020, don't you? And at the time, other people said, no, that's ridiculous. We'll be back in July. Well, some people will maybe be back in July, but she was right. Most of our congregations won't be. So that was one of the things we were trying to do. And the other one was talk about this concept of 50-50 ministry. Don't go hell for leather, do pace yourself. But we were saying to ministers, please do make sure that when you are active, you don't let yourself get sucked into all of your effort and energy going into your existing congregation members. How do I best live stream to them? How do I make sure that there's a phone tree that all of my vulnerable church members get reached and so on? Those things are really important. We weren't saying don't do it, but we were saying please give just as much energy to the stuff that is external to gathered church life, or you know, what the people who would be in gathered church if they could be. And I think looking back on it, there were churches that did take that challenge and churches that didn't. And the ones that didn't found that others in their community probably did take up the slack, maybe more slowly than they would have done if the church had been on board, but still that there was community action that took place without the church involved. And sometimes those church leaders are now saying, and you know, I talked to somebody just this week saying, the trouble is I can't really break into the mutual aid groups and things. And it's like, well, yeah, because they've learned to operate without you at this point. You can maybe be a guest humbly on their various sites, but you're not at the heart of them, and accept that. Whereas others, absolutely, things wouldn't have got up and going, certainly not in a safeguarded way, without the church being involved in that. The other thing just to mention about all this is this recovery on the diagram, it's bumpy, and it really is bumpy. I think I didn't reach one single cliff, but from time to time during this whole process, I've reached little cliffs, and it just feels impossible to pick myself up and get going again. But then I do, and it's fine, and then you hit another piece of discouragement. And part of this has been working these two contexts with the church thinking one thing, and maybe with wider society thinking something else. And there's a surprise for me, the extent to which the non-church groups, if you like, and next episode I'll update you on how we're doing some community organizing through a non-church Facebook group, to the extent that those groups that were set up really to do mutual aid have become quite reflective and are starting to ask about how society might be different, and even some big philosophical questions about the future. And I don't think I expected that to happen. So I suppose I'm quite glad that I'm a guest in those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see that graph. I hadn't seen that before. Look that up. But while we're in the sort of midst of sharing resources, sort of two things that kind of resonated in what you were saying. One, just on the last point you were making about mutual aid, you know, the rise of mutual aid. Lots of questions going on now amongst people we know involved in those groups who were very quick and got themselves up and running very fast. But now, particularly in cases where perhaps there isn't all that much to do, are really struggling to kind of say, well, can we really sustain this, whatever kind of this is? And will there be more than this? And there was a wonderful article sent round about the Black Panthers and how they'd run breakfast clubs kind of on a mutual aid basis in the 70s, but how they always had a kind of an element to it, which was about political education. And it's how do we make the space around mutual aid and that sense of community cohesion and people coming together, and turn that into more than just a response to emergency and a short-term thing. Because as organizers, we know that mobilizing is great. Getting people involved in the short term in social movements is fantastic, but they do not last. They dissolve, which is partly why we try and build broad-based alliances of existing civil society organizations that have you know, roots of hundreds of years and an ambition to stay around for hundreds of years kind of afterwards. There's a great, there's some great articles around that. The other thing I thought would be really interesting, and particularly thinking about your role, Andy, as a trainer and nurturer and developer of ministers, and I have a similar role within Citizens in terms of overseeing our training of leaders and of staff, is that the lockdown in a way has slaughtered some sacred cows in quite a good way in some cases. And that is a real opportunity actually to get people to rethink. Amanda Tattersall, so if I just briefly share my screen a second, has done this great podcast. Amanda is a community organizer from Australia. She helped set up the Sydney Alliance. She's now based at the Sydney Policy Lab at Sydney University, but she runs an excellent podcast called Changemakers. And she's done one on the pandemic called This Is a Big Moment. And one of the things that comes out of that is that she speaks to somebody who's got some expertise in neuroscience or something like that, an academic, who says that one of the things is that at a time of crisis, or immediately as we come out of it, people's brains are often at their most malleable and able to think through, which sounds counterintuitive because you'd think, well, actually your instinctive response would be to revert to what you know. And I think there's an element of that as well that I'm certainly seeing in terms of how people are responding to this, but also they can to new things as well. And she sets out some really excellent ideas in that podcast about how you can, and she's quite challenging to community organizers actually. She comes from our tradition, but is basically saying, look, actually, in her context in Australia, some of the groups that are part of the Sydney Alliance haven't been at the forefront of the response to COVID and have to some degree been found wanting. And yet there have been mutual aid groups and others that have sprung up. And so what does your model say about things like mutual aid groups? How can you work together and relate to one another more effectively and complement and so on? And so for our staff, it's been interesting to see some things which there's been some resistance to, just because things have always been done a particular way. Now that things can't be done in that particular way, it's suddenly opening up all sorts of opportunities to think through how we can do things in a new and maybe better way. Caroline, how about you?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. The initial response in Brightlingsea was very much the Russian heroic response, and the town council and I scrabbled pretty quickly to put some framework around that and some safeguarding around that, which we felt was really important. But there was a huge groundswell of community goodwill and willingness to help one another, which has never really abated. But there are little eddies in it that are less than helpful, and there has become, and this was always present in social media, we all know this, but particularly when people are in a pandemic stuck at home with little else to do, is that you get the scenario where somebody reports something they've seen that they want to tut over, and it's basically an invitation for everybody to pile on and be deeply unpleasant and make steadily escalating judgments on the person without knowing the person, without seeing the incident, without even knowing if it's true. And we had one very unfortunate one recently where a person didn't pick up some rubbish that the observer thought that they ought to have picked up. But what the observer didn't realise was that there was an entire backstory and some ill health and the presence of either Alzheimer's or dementia. And what they basically did was institute a community pile-on that made the recipient of it, who happened to see it but couldn't remember the incident but recognised themselves, just want to leave the town. And so there was a lot of backpedaling and apologising and people actually holding a mirror up to this and saying, well, you know, this is what we did. We made someone so frightened and unhappy that they actually wanted to leave our town when the name of our group is welcome. So there, you know, there are elements of the really unhelpful eddies in that, because inevitably people are looking for things and structures to belong to. And it's been fascinating because I think in community organising, we are better equipped for this kind of upheaval because our model involves disorganising and reorganising according to purpose. So we don't have a meeting unless it's a meeting to plan an action we're going to take or an issue that we're going to tackle. And for each action, we have different leaders who take a lead depending on whose skills are needed. So there isn't that sense of hierarchy in the same way as there is in our institutions. And what we're finding is that institutions are having to go through that process, but not willingly. When, you know, high leading people in institutions are shielding or lack the capacity to operate the technology and others are coming to the fore. And so there's been a lot of shift and a lot of movement. And we're seeing a sort of rise in people who can handle the technology, can adapt, have a certain flexibility of mind, are, you know, rising up as leaders within the community. And that is really unsettling the established powers and the established institutions. So that has been an interesting one. There is a bit of a thread in Brightening Sea of nil desperandum and we don't want to surrender, picking up on that kind of wartime language, which actually is, when you talk about somebody fighting COVID-19 and losing the battle, as a priest, that's deeply unhelpful, because when you're taking a funeral of somebody who's died, actually they died of a virus that overwhelmed their system, that they could not have beaten, because that kind of victory does not depend on your daring do or your ability to stick at it. And the implication that those who die didn't try hard enough is a deeply unhelpful narrative for those who are bereaved. So I have a love-hate relationship with that language, but what it does do on a community level is it creates a kind of enemy against which we battle. And the enemy against which we battle becomes things like loneliness and isolation and the loss of our traditions and the loss of our cohesion. And therefore, people who wouldn't normally take part in a community event, if you do a virtual version of it, they'll jump in because they want to be part of it, because suddenly they see that it's worth fighting for. So there has been this massive collective turning towards what unites us and those points in the year when we come together. And so we've done, you know, a virtual VE Day, massive town-wide socially distanced celebrations in individual roads, and filmed it all and put it in a video. We have done Blessing of the Waters last weekend. So all our gave us video messages, and we and I actually went out on a rather small boat bouncing across the waves and did socially distanced blessing of all the boats with a water pistol, and various bits and pieces, and people gave their houses boat names, and they had distance blessings. And what I found was that people were hollering me over and saying, will you bless me, will you bless my house, can I, you know, I want to be part of this, bless my van, bless my car, bless my you know, family. There is that sense of drawing together being seen as something precious, whereas previously it was taken for granted. And I think when we come out of lockdown, the big worry for me is that we won't all come out of lockdown, and certainly not all at once, that there will be this gradual emergence of certain groups of people first. And if you are in that first wave that gets that freedom and is, you know, comes out of lockdown and resumes some variant of normal or some new kind of life, it's going to be awfully easy to forget those who are still shielding. And a colleague of mine, Katie Tupling, who's been a guest on this podcast, has been doing some interviews, some really amazing interviews with clergy who are shielding, because they're having to really reevaluate and look at and find theology for the position that they're in, where they're not able to physically go out and do the things that they were physically going out and doing. So I think we have a challenge as a society as we emerge, and that is a real justice issue. There is a justice issue around how we treat those who are shielding. There is a justice issue around how we treat those who are digitally disenfranchised, for whom the lockdown experience will have not necessarily been a positive one with occasional dips. It might have been an incredibly long dark night of the soul, or, you know, a truly terrible period of isolation akin to solitary confinement. We don't know, but I have had probably 15 conversations in the last 2 weeks with people who've admitted to having suicidal thoughts at one point or another. So that is something we need to hold on to as we emerge. And there will be this resistance. There'll be this sense of, oh, we've done our mourning and now we can do our celebrating. But part of working for justice is recognising that just because I'm celebrating and I'm all right, doesn't mean everyone's celebrating and everyone's all right. And so the work for justice involves being relationally connected enough that you are connected to stories that are different to your own story. So I think that is our big challenge, is to be connected to the stories from this that are different to our own narrative and different to the narratives perhaps that we're getting in the media.
And I
Yeah,
think you've
that's
got a
really.
poem for us.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
I do have a poem. I do. This is me reflecting a little bit on this podcast and on the one coming up as well. And it's reflecting on experiences of power and solidarity at different levels. When you sit at the tables of the powerful, breaking nations with the bread, the reaching hands of the crushed are weeds. Grind them before they upend things. There's not enough for all. It's complicated. Speaking the truth to power is an everyday crucifixion, pinned between pushed out palms, stifling, rejecting, and the many trembling hands at your back, holding you upright and to account as the blows fall. Climbing is more permanent together, stacking flung stones into a stairway. Strong that all can follow upwards. Many hands make light work. Many hands make light work. In the dark ruts and ditches, illuminating the first step. And when you're on the ground, helpless and on your back and in the dark, the hand that strikes you is an apocalypse. The hand that raises you, Magnificat. The hand in your hand, the very touch of God.
Beautiful. Thank you, Caroline. So this episode is an attempt to answer some questions, and we really want people to send us questions. They can send them to me at randomlyandy@live.com.
Or me at revcarolinebeckett@gmail.com.
And here's our first question, and it's a question about money. Who pays for community organizing? We've been asked. Jonathan, maybe you can answer our listener on a factual level, but it would be great if you could then move on and say something about how money and community organizing are related, because funding isn't a separate thing from the community organizing, is it?
No, maybe I'll start there and then go to the factual afterwards. So critical to the philosophical underpinnings of community organizing is that community experiences some form of social injustice. It doesn't matter whether it's a rich or a poor community or how diverse it is. Obviously, there'll be differences of inequality and injustice, but there is no community that is completely free of every kind of injustice, at least on this earth. And so, what do we do about it? We're compelled to do something about it. And certainly if we're Christians, and Citizens isn't a faith-based or a Christian organization, but about half of our member organizations are institutions of faith. And I think the reason they join is at least partly because they want to be part of making a more just world in the here and now. And they're attracted also perhaps because it's rooted in listening to people in local communities and finding out what the injustice is that affects them and their lives from them and from their stories, not from the pages of the Guardian or the Times or what they've seen on TV, but what is causing injustice for people locally. And our belief is that if you get people in a local community to do that listening, to share their stories of what makes them angry and what they'd like to change, that most communities and most people in those communities are able to diagnose the issue without much difficulty. And normally they can come up with a good, constructive solution. The problem is they don't have enough power to be able to change the thing that they are seeking to change. And so how do they get power? And you mentioned earlier on that we talk about community organizing. If you don't get a seat at the table, then you're probably on the menu. So it's about how do we get a seat at the table with power holders, not to dominate them, not to replace them, not to usurp, but to hold them to account and to negotiate and to try and negotiate a better common good solution. And you can build power in two ways. It's interesting, I can see behind Andy's head, Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky, which is one of the seminal works of community organizing. And Alinsky, there we are, you've got a matching copy. Somewhat to my embarrassment, I haven't got a copy behind me. I should. But Alinsky said that power is drawn to two poles, organized money on the one end and organized people on the other. And he broadly says, and why we pursue community organizing, is that we have lots of people, whereas the state and the market who are trying to hold to account tend to have a lot more money than we do, certainly at a kind of community level. So mostly community organizing focuses on organizing large numbers of people through the existing civil society organizations of which they're a part, their church, their school, their mosque, their trade union, their community support group, whatever it is, but where people gather together and they join together in alliance to hold those powerful decision makers to account and to get a seat at the table. But, Alinsky says, we do have to organize a bit of money as well, because actually this work requires resourcing. It requires people to be trained, and that costs. It requires people to be found and connected in together, and that takes staff time, which costs. It requires placards and banners for actions. Thinking about your swimming pool action, Caroline, in Colchester, we had to buy armbands for the founding assembly, and that needed to be funded. We needed to, increasingly we do stuff that's online as well as face-to-face. We need people who've got the skills and ability to put stuff on Twitter and Facebook and have a website and so on and so forth. So the work needs resourcing, which is why we need to organize some money. But there's another deeper thing as well, I think, because, and I learned this when my sort of journey through politics. I worked in government for a while, in Westminster for a government minister and an MP in a kind of political capacity. And then I worked at the Refugee Council. And the Refugee Council did amazing work, but it was really hamstrung in its campaigning ability by the fact that it was 90% funded at the time by the Home Office, really the target of most of our campaigns, because they were the ones making life difficult for people in our communities. And so that made it really hard because, as you know, you can't really bite the hand that feeds you. And so we would do our best to run campaigns on issues like destitution or child detention, but there would always be a point where we'd be sort of gently encouraged not to go too far in our campaign. Otherwise, you know, the Home Office funding for the next year might be under threat, or we might get less money. And that always didn't quite ring true for me and didn't feel quite right. So what I love about the citizens model is that we're not primarily funded by government. We don't take government money for our core organizing work, nor are we primarily funded by charitable trusts. We do get some money from charitable trusts, but that also always comes with strings attached. And while they may be very benevolent strings and they may be very worthy causes that they want you to support, ultimately you're working to the agenda of the charitable trust. And so we have a model called membership dues, where institutions, not individuals, pay dues of anything between about £500 a year to £20,000 a year, depending on the size of the organisation. And then that funds the core of our organising work. And the beauty of that is, basically, we're not beholden to the government or to a charitable trust. We can decide to work even on quite unpopular or difficult causes without people threatening to withdraw our funding. But also it means, more importantly, that those organizations that put their money in own the organization and decide democratically what the issues are. So although Citizens is most well known for things like the Living Wage campaign or our work around refugees, those just tend to be local campaigns that have scaled up and made an impact across the UK. That is not the bread and butter of community organising. The bread and butter are the local campaigns, like the swimming pool campaign in Colchester, the things that emerge from people's local kind of lived experience. And every alliance chooses the issues. They don't get told what to do by me or somebody in London who says, well, the strategic thing to do at the minute is work on this. So therefore now, Essex, you've got to work on this. The issues emerge out of that kind of local and lived experience. And we can do that because every organisation that is in membership for Citizens says, well, we pay our membership dues. It's us money. It's our investment in social justice and in working together for the common good of our community. But that also means we get to have a say in choosing the issues. It's ownership money. It's money saying we own our alliance and we're going to help shape democratically with others the campaigns that emerge at a local level. Does that cover it? Have I missed anything?
That covers it pretty well. And here are two questions that I think we can tackle together. So a listener has also been in touch to ask, I love all this talk of the common good, but isn't it a fact that if we don't get more people attending our churches, we'll all be an irrelevant minority, unable to get anything done? And someone else has asked, Has the Church of England lost all moral authority to organise the community?
So if I start, so the second question, has the Church of England lost all moral authority to organise the community? Hopefully the answer to that is yes. I am really uncomfortable with the idea that churches have some sort of moral authority and hence ought to be running communities. That's not the way it works at all. We are a minority. I don't know how long we, the believing in Jesus members of this nation, have been a minority. My guess is always. Certainly, I find it hard to believe there was some golden age, maybe in the sort of 17th century or something, when most of the population were followers of Jesus. I don't think that was the case. But we've now recognized, I hope, that we, the disciples of Jesus, are very definitely a minority. Jesus is still Lord. The gospel is still clear. The invitation is still universal, but we are a minority group. So what can we do as a minority? Can we change anything? Well, you'll have heard the famous quotation from Margaret Mead: never doubt that a small community or a small minority of committed people can change the world. As a matter of fact, it's the only thing that has ever changed the world. You don't have to say, oh, we are a minority in society, so we have nothing to contribute. On the contrary, I think what we want to say is we recognize that we're a minority. We're going to be in alliance with others at various points, but we are unashamed of bearing witness to the God of all, who longs for the common good of all to be lifted up and done in this nation. How would you put it, Jonathan, as somebody who's both a professional community organizer and a Christian disciple?
I'm also an Anglican, but in Wales, so we're not established. I know that there's also an element of this which comes from the kind of the establishment of the Church of England, and that still has a relevance and and some degree of deference and an opportunity to access power. And so sometimes that can mean that community organising can feel quite challenging to Anglican clergy, actually, because it feels like you're potentially sharing your precious special privilege of access with, you know, the nonconformists and the Catholics and the Muslims and people without faith all together. But I also think it depends on how you think about your community, because if you think really your relationships, and this is where your 50-50 idea comes in, are really all about the people who come into your church on a Sunday, well then I think it does seem hard to think about how you can even get involved in organising your community. But actually, if you think about, I think one of the great advantages of the Church of England is the parish system in many ways, because you all have an area and a large group of people for who you have a responsibility. And what's that William Temple quote about, you know, the Church of England is the only organisation that exists for those who are outside of its membership, or something along those lines, primarily for the benefit of those outside of its membership. And we've seen some really interesting examples of community organising. I'll just share one very quickly, of a parish in South London, which is a number of years ago, who in response to the 2011 riots said, well, actually, we're really uncomfortable about the fact that we've got an estate in our parish where lots of people involved in the riots were from, and yet really it's very near to the church, but it doesn't feel like we really have lots of relationships in there, and that doesn't necessarily feel like part of the parish, which is otherwise quite well to do. And their response to that was to go and organise and to do a whole lot of listening. So we went and knocked on every door in that estate twice over a 3-month period to basically ask the question, what are you angry about and what would you like to change? And off the back of that, we ended up helping to build a whole lot of residents' associations in those areas. But the reason why the church suddenly got very convicted about that estate is because in the first listening walk we went to do, 2 things happened. The first thing was that the parish priest noticed that all of the tower blocks were named after archbishops of Canterbury. which speaks interestingly to the kind of connection between church and state. And so you had this situation where people were living in housing of often very poor quality and that wasn't being properly maintained, yet named after archbishops. The first thing. The second thing was that they discovered that there was one member of their congregation who did live in that state, who revealed to them for the first time that they never came to any church activities in the evening during the winter because of the drug dealers operating on her stairwell, and that she was simply too afraid to leave her house after dark, or indeed to have people over to her house, and that had essentially excluded her from a whole load of church activities. And people could not believe this. They had no idea that this was the case for someone that they knew and respected and was part of that congregation. And so that gave them real energy into it. And off the back of that, not only did they help build all these residence associations that then took a very proactive role in holding the local council to account, getting a whole load of repairs done, millions of pounds of repairs done early. They got a new sports pitch for the kids, and they developed and trained a whole ton of leaders in that area and gave them hope. And what was great about it is that they didn't insist that the people came through the church in order to do that. They said, our ministry parish is to be alongside you and in solidarity. And so they helped them build organizations in parallel and in partnership with the church that can act for the common good. So that's one little idea. And the church, was a reasonably sizable church, 200 people in the congregation by Anglican standards. But of course, there were thousands and thousands of people in that parish. And with that small group of committed citizens, as Andy quoted Margaret Mead earlier, they were able to make some really substantial change, even in the context of a riot just having happened and a lot of anger. So the church is brilliantly placed to do this. So on the one hand, I don't think we should assume that we have a divine right to organize communities in a benevolent and paternalistic way, and in a way that suits us. On the other hand, we shouldn't let us use that as an excuse to not do anything. Because I think there is a real opportunity for the church to be prophetic here. One quick other example. Everybody's coming out, or has been in previous weeks, to clap Thursday evening. We had one of our leaders in Cardiff come to us, who went on the 6-day training last year, to say how empty that felt, because she's a care worker, when she then has to go into the care home, having caught coronavirus herself, without proper PPE and on the minimum wage. How empty that felt that people were clapping her. And she said, this came out of the listening process, she said, when I hear the clapping, I don't hear applause in the kind of conventional, supportive, encouraging way. I hear the sound of what happens when a gladiator goes into the ring and the crowd are clapping them or cheering them potentially to their death. And off the back of that testimony, we started a whole campaign at Citizens about trying to get the real living wage of £9.30 an hour for care workers. And critical to that has been clergy, many of whom have been a bit bereft because they're not able to do Sunday services, and the symbolic role of their ministry is often underutilized at this time. They're lovely to hear about Caroline's of spraying water over to bless boats. They've been out blessing care homes, but not just blessing, because that would be empty if it wasn't accompanied by some action for justice. They've been building relationships with care workers and then lobbying their politicians, their council leaders and their MPs to say these care workers deserve a real living wage of £9.30 an hour. And clergy have played a really important role, from local parish priests to so that's an action that any member of the clergy listening or watching this podcast can do. We've got a toolkit about how to do it on our Citizens website, but is one way in which you can listen. So we encourage everybody to listen to a care worker first. You can do that on a Thursday evening Zoom call that we set up, then to act by blessing the care home in recognition and appreciation of those care workers, send them some cookies or some donuts or some flowers or whatever, and then to take political action in a prophetic way to challenge our politicians to say, how can we be allowing this? And ultimately, the government needs to invest more money into the system. So I think those are two examples of ways in which we can temper some humility about our role as Christians, as a minority, with also some courage to actually get involved and take prophetic action.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
So and I guess
from my sort of point of view on this one, I just want to give 4 really quick thoughts. Number one, if we are a minority and we see ourselves as small, anyone who underestimates a minority has never baked bread with yeast and never planted a mustard seed. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would say to that. Small can be incredibly powerful, mobile and flexible. The second thing that I would say is that when we talk about the church organising the community or somebody else organising the community, in citizens' terms, very pragmatically, the community is organised by those who organise the community. And what I mean to say is decisions are made by those who turn up. So as a church, if we want to be involved in organising the community, we have to turn up. We have to turn up where the community is being organised. We have to be part of that organising process and not wait in our building for the community to come to us and request to be organised, because those days, if they ever existed, are long gone. So that's the second thing. The third thing that I take issue with slightly is this idea of attending church as being a measure. Now, we have a whole load of people who attend church for coffee mornings and after school activities and clubs and Sunday services and funerals and weddings. I'm not sure that that necessarily always overlaps with faith, and certainly not with the kind of faith that is transformative, that is an active and living walk with Jesus. But we are all on a journey of faith. It's not as simple as you turn up to the building, therefore you're a Christian. And I think nearly all of us know that. That's not to say that attending isn't important, because I've just spoken about the fact that attending is important. But attending is a small part of what it means to follow Jesus. And the last thing that I would say is that when we speak about the word of God and we speak the words of God in the community, we have to remember that when God speaks, action is simultaneous with the word. When God said, "Let there be light," there was light. God's speech is performative, and our speech needs to be performative as well. We need to be doing the good news that we're telling people about. We need to be being the gospel as well as speaking about the gospel. We need to achieve that simultaneous action and speech that is the nature of God, that can be in us and that we can be fashioned into.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. We've been talking a long time, so I think we're going to come to an end there. We've got more listener questions that we haven't reached today, but that's okay. Caroline and I will do our best to answer those next time, and the additional ones that you might send in. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Together, we've been
at a distance
rethinking Christian
leadership.
community, or even leadership. Thank you all.